All right. So today we got Jackson Peos, and I'm excited for this, man. I've especially recently been diving into more and more of your content. And it's funny because one of the things that caught my eye at first was actually like a Dragon Ball Z thing on Instagram. And
Ah,
I was a
perfect.
huge Dragon Ball Z fan growing up. So I was like, who is this guy? And I started digging through, and then I saw, I think maybe it was Revive Stronger. Have you been on that podcast as
Yeah,
well?
yeah, Steve's
Right.
pod. Yep.
Yeah, so I heard that, and then, like I said before, the Ultimate Base conference as well, Ultimate Evidence Based Conference. So you've been on a lot of stuff, man. You've been popping up more and more and more in my feed. So I really like what you're doing, and I'm excited to have you here.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. I'm happy to chat.
So first and foremost, give the listeners an idea of, I mean, essentially, like who is Jackson? Like, how did you get to where you are? Like, why did you dive into this, and what do you actually do today?
Yeah, so basically, as a child, I was just a sport head and a massive athlete at heart. And I competed in sports my whole life, going up to semi-professional in Australian rules football, and a state rower, and competing pretty high level in athletics during school time. As school was sort of coming to a close, my passion for sport was as high as it ever could be. And I just found myself naturally starting to ask questions about how I could sort of improve performance in this or get a bit stronger in that. And basically that sort of was a very basic self-directed introduction into the evidence-based method, essentially, which is trying to sort of peruse the material that's out there, interpret it, make sense of it, and then try and apply it to your own training with and nutrition, with the hope of sort of maximizing the potential benefits and response that you can get. So when I finished up school, I was just out of pure interest and enjoyment. I was already sort of going through some basic research studies and things like that, purely just to enhance my own performance. And then I got into an undergraduate degree at the University of Western Australia. I double majored in sports science and exercise and health. I did quite well with that, and offered a position to complete an honours degree, which is sort of like an introduction into research. And that was in exercise physiology, and that was I ran a couple of studies focusing on blood flow restriction training and things like that, and the mechanisms underlying the muscle growth with those. And during that sort of mid-year, when I was doing some sort of advanced exercise physiology sort of lectures and teachings, and sort of starting to really dig into like the biochemistry and things like that, I found my passion for the nutrition side, or the nutrition niche of sports science sort of just kept growing and growing. And I found myself sort of constantly just gravitating towards nutrition all the time. And I worked out quite quickly that when you're looking at sports athletes, particularly elite athletes, their training's all pretty good, really. Like, it doesn't vary too much. They're all training like pretty high damn volume. They're all pushing themselves at pretty high relative intensities. But where there can be substantial gains made is with the nutrition side of things. And I'm not sure, I assume that there would be similar parallels where you're based, but in Australia, even our elite athletes, they would have no comprehending of the macronutrient breakdown of the meals they're eating. That and a lot of their nutrition education is based on what they see on television or what they hear on the news or what their buddy told him that he should eat. So what I found was that because when working with sports athletes and competitive athletes, which I wanted to do, I found that you sort of even the most perfect optimal training periodized program that you can set for an athlete, you might have to get them run at like 4 or 5 months if they're already at the elite level to notice some actual like improvements. And even then, because everyone's already training so damn hard anyway, it's still quite difficult to sort of bridge a gap between your athlete and the competition. But with nutrition, because I found that a lot of the sports athletes had a long way to go in terms of optimization of that side of things. All it really took was for me to give a few simple tweaks here and there, and you get immediate response. And all of a sudden these athletes like, holy crap, I feel the best I ever have before. I just finished off the back of a prep with an Olympic boxer for the qualifications for the Tokyo Olympics. And we sort of teed up about 12 weeks before the qualifiers. And this is a girl who's one of the best boxers in Australia. And they don't get one-on-one nutrition advice, and she wasn't sure what she'd be doing with diet, and she was often having to rely on sauna to make weight and things like that. And then she came to me, and we were able to get her on weight without having to use any dehydration strategies, and just some gradual sort of calorie restriction and a few little hunger management techniques. And then we had her on weight a couple of days before the fight. She could rest, eat up, no sort of like, because with the amateurs, you're making what you're saunaing in the morning, and then you're sort of trying to chuck in a bunch of water, fluids and food in like the couple of hours before you go out and fight. And it's just far from ideal. And this was one of her best sort of competitive appearance so far. So, and that just sort of really resonates with me because, and just confirms my speculation that even elite athletes, where that we might assume from the outset that they're doing their nutrition on point and quite diligently and in an evidence-based fashion, but often they're not. They're just training really damn hard, and they're just trying to eat what they think they should eat or what their buddy told them to eat. So yeah, I really started sinking my teeth into nutrition because I was like, holy crap, I can make a big difference here, and I can make a fast difference. So fast track that was to the end of my honors degree. I did well in my honors studies, so I was offered a PhD scholarship. And that's when I decided I was going to go head on focusing on nutrition strategies and nutrition research. And specifically, how could we get athletes in the best body composition possible by dietary means while minimizing the harms to performance and things like that. What are the sort of most optimal and novel dietary strategies that we can use to have our athletes basically on point? So that's where I am at the moment. I've got a couple of studies just completed that are in manuscript preparation, which have looked at the implementation of diet breaks. So higher feeding periods sort of sprinkled within throughout a weight loss phase, with the hypothesis that these higher feeding periods or the diet breaks might minimize some of the negative adaptations that often accompany weight loss or dieting. I'm also looking at a couple of satiety management research studies, basically the effects of different macronutrient breakdowns and energy densities consumed at breakfast, and what sort of influence that has on ad libitum food consumption at sort of 3 hours later at around lunchtime. So yeah, I've got plenty to do, but that's probably a quick rundown of where I got to here today.
Before I dive into any questions on any of that or the ones I have lined up, are you allowed to share any of what those research studies are showing that are currently under review?
I can talk about some of the preliminary findings. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, and I think even with the fact that you're in the midst of a diet break study is perfect, because that's the main topic for today. So you obviously have a really fresh opinion on it. So my main first question, just kind of like throw it to you and let you run with it, is I mean, after reviewing other people's research, we know a few that have come out, and considering other intermittent restriction over the years that has come out, and then what you're doing right now, I mean, what's your conclusion? Like, what do you feel like you've learned about them? I know originally, and this is a while back, when they first started popularizing, it was almost like too good to be true. And we thought like it would just reverse all these processes and these adaptations that are happening. Maybe these physiological benefits aren't completely true. But I still believe, as a practitioner, I use diet breaks all the time. So I had somebody ask me like, hey, Brandon said he didn't really agree with some of the research. And I was like, I see the points, but it works in experience. So I still feel value inside of using diet breaks across the board, regardless of what a study says. Just for your context of where I stand, but I would love for you to kind of rip that apart and go in depth with what you see.
So my stance has definitely changed over the last probably 18 months. So in 2019, I published a review paper with Eric Helms, Lane Norton, Dr. Andy Galpin and co. And basically we reviewed all the intermittent dieting research that was out there, and intermittent dieting, including things like refeeds and diet breaks. And at that time, we didn't have any studies completed in an athlete population. We were just focusing on the refeed diet break studies that were mostly in overweight human models or overweight animal models. And from the literature that we had at that point, it seemed to me like any protocol that was using moderate intermittent energy restrictions, so not like smashing people with really severe deficits during the dieting periods and then having like a moderate sort of refeeding on diet break somewhere around maintenance. It looked like those protocols almost always yielded some benefits over continuous dieting throughout the whole time, even moderate continuous dieting for the duration of the weight loss phase. So I was quite confident at that point that, hey, yeah, okay, these refeeds and diet breaks, they've got something. And if you go back and read the paper, I talked about the evidence that shows that these higher feeding periods might sort of offset some of the downgrades in resting metabolic rate, potentially sustain a more ideal hormonal profile, potentially enhance performance and even lean mass retention over the course of the weight loss phase. Like, these were a lot of the benefits that I was speculating. Since I published that paper, my stance has sort of done a little bit of a flip, and I do think it could be a bit of a case of it is too good to be true, in a sense. That's not to say I don't think they have any benefits. I just think the benefits that are often parroted around in this little fitness community are heavily overblown. And that's on the basis of not only my studies with the refeeds, the diet break studies that I've completed over the last 12 months, but even the Campbell paper with the double day refeed study. I'm just not convinced that, well, firstly, for my diet break study, the general trends are not showing superior fat loss, resting metabolic rate retention, hormonal restoration. We're not even seeing like notable increases in leptin during the diet break, which is what everyone's been sort of throwing around the trap for years and years and years. And I think that's a case because when we were sort of thinking this leptin was this sort of golden ticket, it was often based on a lot of overfeeding studies, where they're not consuming energy balance, they're consuming really large surpluses to cause these increases in leptin, which are also causing increases in adipose, and adipose secretes the leptin. So, but with refeeds and diet breaks, if we're adding adipose, it probably doesn't even really matter that we're releasing more leptin, because we've just added more fat that we need to get off later on. And I haven't seen better, just from the general trend so far, not seeing better lean mass retention in the group with the diet breaks either. So physiologically, I don't think that 7-day diet breaks every 3 weeks of dieting are going to enhance the bottom line if we're just from a purely physiological perspective. But I think what they can do is help indirectly, because some of the other trends are showing that those in the diet break group, they're having reduced hunger levels. Their hunger just seems to be a lot more consistent and lower and closer to baseline values, whereas the continuous dieting group, over their 12 weeks of dieting, it just seems to go bang, like straight up, and hunger is sort of getting out of control by the end. And we're also seeing that the guys in the diet break group, they had lowered irritability and higher alertness. And I think that's probably a follow-on effect from sort of having lower food focus, lower hunger, that they feel less shitty, maybe a little bit more sort of focused on their day-to-day activities, as opposed to the continuous dieting group, who's perhaps just thinking about clock watching till when their next meal is, or whatnot. So from an adherence perspective, this is still important, because obviously if we can design a dietary protocol that has lower hunger over the course of the weight loss phase, that is surely going to lead to better results. With really elite athletes, it probably doesn't matter too much, because they just stick to the plan regardless. You tell them to eat dirt, they eat it. But for more of the less advanced, less elite athletes, or even just the gen poppers trying to look a bit better naked, diet breaks could be quite valuable for them, because it just allows their hunger to stay a little bit more under control and potentially sort of reduce binge eating episodes and overeating on the plan. And that might cause sort of better fat loss and better results, but mainly from an indirect perspective, as opposed to these diet breaks having these direct physiological advantages which are initially proposed. Now, the same can be said for the, people might be a little bit confused, but the same can be said for the refeed study by Campbell. Now, when this paper got published, everyone was sort of saying, oh, see, we knew that refeeds enhanced metabolic rate, and we knew that it maintained fat-free mass. But when you actually look at the data, there are no between group differences for the change in resting metabolic rate or the change in fat-free mass alone between the groups. The only difference that stands is this dry fat-free mass, which is basically they've just taken fat-free mass and then they've subtracted body water using ultrasound, which has its own flaws in itself. And it's not, as far as I know, it's not like this dry fat-free mass method they use is not validated in the research. So I think they created it. And yeah, but that unfortunately wasn't the conclusions that the authors made. The authors said that yes, using double-day refeeds will retain more resting metabolic rate, fat-free mass and dry fat-free mass, where in reality, I think the conclusion should be refeeds won't retain more fat-free mass or resting energy expenditure compared to continuous energy restriction, but they will retain a little bit more dry fat-free mass. But I even have some question marks over the legitimacy of the dry fat-free mass greater retention, because their final testing session happened only 2 days post the final refeed. Now, this dry fat-free mass that they're seeing, like the other group, they're being weighed, they're having their measurements 2 days after their 7 weeks of straight dieting. How low is their glycogen level is going to be, which is a component of dry fat-free mass. It doesn't matter if you count the water, the glycogen is still there. Now we've got this group who's just done a 2-day refeed, and they're being measured 48 hours later. What is the potential for there being some residual glycogen left over? I'd say there's pretty high. And I'd say that potentially this difference or this better retention in dry fat-free mass that was reported is just a result of this acute sort of storage of glycogen that hasn't sort of fully dissipated just yet. Now, a lot of people seem to think or have this misconception that by accounting for water that they're accounting for glycogen, but that's just not the case. We have dry glycogen, and that still contains mass, and that it's going to be 25% of the weight of the glycogen and the fluid combined. So yeah, I would have liked to see them have their final testing, instead of 2 days post refeed, have it 5 days post refeed, like, because they did 5 days of consecutive dieting, measure them just before their next refeed. So you've actually probably accounted for those short-term glycogen storage effects. So yeah, I have a few question marks about that study. I think in some circles and among people who don't have scientific expertise, it's probably gone a shot over their head a little bit. And if they're only reading the conclusions, they're probably going to go tell their buddies that, yep, okay, we can have refeeds because we're going to maintain more resting metabolic rate and more muscle during our dieting. But those conclusions just ain't supported by the data, in my opinion.
That's really, really similar to the kind of argument or the stance Brandon had when he came on and we did kind of a research review. And it's funny because like the thing I asked him was, do you think there's any indirect benefits of it? And that's basically what you said as well. And I think that for me as a coach, it's more about, is this going to help this person follow the diet for a longer period of time without falling off track? And like, that's
I think without a doubt, for most people, without a doubt, the psychological advantages are going to be very prominent. And it doesn't need to just be from the benefits that I talked about, that I've noticed in the diet break study of sort of reduced hunger, reduced irritability, higher alertness. You got to also factor in things like the opportunity to now have social meals with friends and family on a Saturday or a Sunday when your diet break or your refeed is scheduled. Just simple things like that can increase the overall enjoyment of the protocol itself, make it feel a little bit less restrictive and less sort of disastrous. And that in itself can be an indirect adherence measure.
Do you think, I have a couple questions following up with it. One is just how long this research studies that you're doing are, and then the second would be, do you like, I mean, because the muscle is, there's a lot of muscle glycogen and fluid stored in the muscle cell. Do you think that there's any benefit to these from a muscle maintenance or performance maintenance standpoint, just simply because you're consistently replenishing every so often versus if you did a 16-week diet without any refeeds, even if it is just muscle glycogen, if you feel better in the gym, like 16, 20, 24 weeks, is that going to end up paying off? I know it's hard to do that long of a study, but do you think there's any benefit from that point?
It's funny you say that. I've actually dug into this exact question in one of my other studies,
Oh,
which is
good.
going to be published quite soon. So what we did was, so my original diet break study went for basically 15 weeks. So we had one group with the diet breaks who dieted 3 weeks straight, then had 1 week diet breaks and just cycled that over until 15 weeks were done. And then we had the continuous group who did 12 weeks dieting straight. We retested them, and then we gave them their 3 week diet break, but at the end, so it took them to 15 weeks, so we could measure after equal dieting weeks versus also after equal absolute time to see if there are any differences. It just makes it a better controlled study. Now, what I ended up deciding to do was sort of add on a second study where we took the diet break group who had just done their 15 weeks, and we said, can you come back to the lab, or can you do another diet break, sort of a week 16 test protocol, if you would. So they were just on the back of 3 weeks of deficit straight. And then we said, okay, we want you to come back to the lab on day 1 of the diet break, give you a new diet break for 7 days, and then come back on day 7 again. And we looked at things like appetite, fat-free mass, resting metabolic rate, and performance. Now, what we saw was if we compare the changes in performance over the complete weight loss phase over the 15 weeks, it doesn't look like there's that much difference if we map it over a full weight loss phase. But when we compare performance immediately pre, so day 1 of the diet break, versus immediately post, so day 8 of the diet break after 7 days in energy balance, we see significant improvements in muscle endurance, most notably in the legs. Now, what that tells me is like you said, it's probably a short-term or acute increase in muscle glycogen that's allowing sort of the muscle to train a little bit harder for longer before fatiguing. This is quite short-term, so I think that benefit's only going to last for as long as like the extra glycogen's hanging around, and that's probably why we didn't see a better maintenance of performance over the course of a 15-week intervention, because each post-diet break, they probably elevated muscle glycogen for like maybe just as long as the time that they're in energy balance. Maybe once, as soon as they go back to the deficit, sort of those performances go down as the glycogen gets flushed out. But that still has merit, because that could say, well, okay, when you're having your diet breaks, we know that you're going to have, at least during the diet break, you're going to have enhanced endurance capacity. So would that then make sense for us to have that would provide athletes with an opportune time for really intense high volume training, perhaps sort of their highest volume week or highest intensity week pre-deload or something like that, because it's just going to mean that their performance is going to be optimized, and they're going to temporarily negate some of the performance impairments as a result from dieting, only for 7 days, but that will still allow them to have a really, really productive week of training with really high output volume intensity that they probably otherwise wouldn't have been able to have if they did that week on like a deficit week. So I think there's definitely something to be said for synchronizing these periods of energy balance with either like an outcome focused training week where you might be doing testing in the gym or something like that, or at least like a really high volume or high intensity week where that extra calories is probably going to improve your ability to train harder for longer. And that could provide an indirect sort of competitive edge in the long run on competition day or show day.
I love that. That's a perfect answer to kind of where my mind was going. Now that like we've kind of gone through all these scenarios and these different studies, I'm curious if you're it probably wasn't the first, so you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but one of the like more prominent ones that first came out on this idea was the Matador study. And like, everybody was raving about it. It was like, I just remember reading tons of different reviews and people talking about it. And I even remember a lot of coaches immediately jumping and thinking like that's what they had to do. So I'm really just curious of your thoughts. I shouldn't say I've never, I typically don't follow a structure like that with any clients. I just took some pieces out of the study that I thought were valuable for my coaching experience. But what are your opinions with that? Did you find any flaws with the Matador study and how they approached it? Because they had, from the sounds of it, some pretty favorable results at the end of it, according to their authors.
Mhm. So one of the authors of the Matador is actually part of my research group. So we've spoken in depth about that study and sort of once my findings started coming to light, how would they factor into what the Matador showed? Now, some of the takeaways that I've had after those discussions is that so the group using the 2-week diet breaks after every 2 weeks of dieting in the Matador, they maintained a higher resting metabolic rate and they lost more fat over the course of the intervention compared to the continuous dieting group. Now, on face value, you would say, okay, the diet breaks are causing a physiological advantage here that are sort of probably allowing us to maintain a higher metabolic rate, and we're burning more calories throughout the day, and that's sort of having a downstream effect on burning more fat across the intervention. That's one simple way to look at it. But after looking at the data, the better retention of resting metabolic rate, even though it was significant, doesn't seem to be large enough to explain the size of the fat loss benefits that were seen with the diet break group. That from memory, they retained around 150 calories per day more than the continuous dieting group, which is not enough to explain the kilos more fat loss that they achieved. But once I've factored into the preliminary findings of my diet break study, which is called the ice cap study, we're considering that the diet break group is showing notably lower hunger levels. What I think is that the group who were using the 2-week diet breaks after every 2 weeks of dieting, I think they had lower hunger and more managed hunger. And this led to them sticking to the plan a little bit better. And that's what caused the greater amount of fat loss. And when we factor that in, perhaps that's why there was the notable increase in fat loss that happened over the 15 weeks. Whereas I think in the continuous dieting group, I think their hunger might have just sort of got out of control at times. And that's what caused them to sort of slip off the plan and eat off and potentially slow some of that fat loss. Now, we need to remember that this is in a population of overweight men. Now, the assumption is that they have some difficulties with energy restraint or caloric restraint. So in populations like that, we just can't expect for them to have precise sort of follow dietary protocols precisely. And for those sort of people who are just volunteering in studies, when the hunger gets high enough, they often don't have enough driver to say, okay, I'm going to override these hunger cues and I'm just going to dig in regardless. A lot of the times when the hunger kicks in, they're like, oh, don't like that, I'm going to have a Mars bar sort of thing. And that's essentially why they remain in the body composition state that they do. Whereas I don't think we saw the same fat loss benefits in the ice cap study with athletes, because I think athletes just have experience and they're a little bit wired differently where things get a little bit tough and they sort of go, oh yeah, well, I knew this was coming. And it's like, it's part of the process and now we get on with it. So I think even though the continuous diet group might have had more hunger that weren't having the diet breaks, I think they sort of just said, oh, well, we know dieting sucks anyway, but that's how you get the results. So they just pushed on and perhaps had there were less threats to their adherence, even though their hunger was higher.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to like it being too good to be true. Like you said at the beginning, like seeing the results and people jumping to conclusions of it being some kind of hormonal or metabolic thing might not be the case, but if it indirectly helps adherence, that can be a win. But I would agree with like, if we're talking about physique athletes or even just sport athletes, like usually a little bit of restriction sometimes even motivates them more because they like the grind, you know? And I think that's just part of it.
Athletes are weird, man. Yeah.
So it's different. with these studies in the ones you did, or I believe Bill Campbell's did, according to what they came up with. But at the end of the study, at the same weeks, was the same. Have you seen that even with diet breaks, for the most part, you're going to see the same amount of fat loss if you take the diet breaks versus without? And in that case, like, why not have some high calorie days?
Yeah. So in simple answer, no, I haven't seen better fat loss with the diet breaks. So yes, from one perspective, we say, hey, like, why not put in some diet breaks every 3 weeks then? Because it's not going to hurt our fat loss. But that doesn't mean there's no downsides, because after all, we've got to remember that, let's say a continuous dieting group lost the fat in 12 weeks because they just did 12 weeks of straight dieting. Now the intermittent diet break group, they lost the same amount of weight, the same amount of fat, but it took them 15 weeks when you account for the 3 weeks of diet break. So that might be a worthy trade-off for a bodybuilding competitor who's got 30 weeks before their show. But for some athletes, like you might have a MMA fighter who comes to you 10 weeks out. You might not have the luxury to sprinkle in these diet breaks. So you just got to sort of, just got to push them continuously. So I think that the only downside is the greater time commitment that's going to be coming with using diet breaks, because basically it's diet breaks is where you just basically chuck the car in neutral. You sort of, you're not really progressing too far. You sort of just coast for a little bit. Like fat loss isn't really occurring during those periods. You sort of just put things on pause. So it's actually, it's time spent when you're not per se getting closer to your goal. So if you are really time restricted, perhaps a continuous approach would be a better option, because you can just get in, get out, get it done, and then back to sort of performing optimally. But for a lot of other competitors who perhaps they're really struggling with hunger, and perhaps they don't have really hard time frames, and perhaps they would prefer to have a little bit sort of less stress on the psychology. In that case, maybe some of these diet breaks and refeeds would be a pretty smart move.
I'd love to hear your application of it, like knowing all of this and knowing exactly, I mean, even like what has changed, because I'm sure once upon a time you probably jumped all over them, used them more than you do now, maybe. But are you still using diet breaks? And if you are, how are you structuring these?
Yeah, so I still am using them. Probably less often. They were sort of part and parcel of anyone in the fat loss stage at one point in time, when I was sort of designing up my review paper. But now it's sort of basically I have a checklist. If we have plenty of time, the client has plenty of time to reach their goal, and not a whole lot of fat to lose, then I will implement diet breaks most likely, just because I think the benefits of lower hunger, less irritability, higher alertness, they're all quite notable, and they can have indirect sort of adherence advantages, and even indirect competitive advantages. Because like if you're always so food focused, how are you going to be focusing on your competitive goal and your training sessions and things like that? I'd rather save that sort of mental capacity and mental resources, which are finite, to be focused towards what's important, not sort of always thinking about when your next meal is. So I will use them often a week-long diet break every 4 to 6 weeks is usually what I'll go with, sometimes 3 to 6 weeks. And it will be basically scaled with how much time we've got before the competition. If they come to me 30 weeks out, then I'm usually quite comfortable to do a diet break every 3 weeks. If they come to me 15 weeks out, they might only get 1 or 2 diet breaks during that whole weight loss intervention. So it's basically scaled with how much time they've got before the target and how much fat they've got to lose. If I've worked with combat fighters in the past, and often they might just find out that they've got a fight in a couple of months, and then you sort of straight into weight cut and camp, bang on. And in some of those cases, you just don't have the time luxury to be able to implement diet breaks, because if you're spending sort of a week at maintenance where you're not actually getting closer to your weight category, sort of that can mean that the deficit weeks following need to be too aggressive and too severe, and it's just not worthwhile.
Ever since all this research came out, it kind of seemed like originally it was like a cheat meal and then a cheat day and then a refeed day and then 2-day refeed and then it was 3-day diet break and now it's like week, you know. And now a lot of people are like, it's no point. Like just take maintenance phases and like lean gaining phases and then do a cut. Do
Yeah.
you think that there's no point in refeeds now either, or do you still tend to use those ever?
No, I still do refeeds. It's so funny how sometimes we start so simply and
Hmm.
then we get more and more advanced and technical. And then as more research comes out, we always just end up going back to the simple
Yeah.
stuff over again. It's so funny. It doesn't, it's not even just in nutrition only. It happens in training all the time. We get these
Yeah.
really, really complex like frequencies and periodization programs. And then we end up back where we started. So I will use refeeds is a good one if they don't have the time luxury to have week-long diet breaks, but you still want to provide the athlete or the client with a little bit of psychological refreshment. And often I just try to pitch it as like instead of like a refeed meal per se, I'll call it like a reward meal or a reward day. Usually it's a reward meal because I find that if you're going from deficit to maintenance for 1 day or 2 days and you spread that over 5 meals, the meals are relatively the same and it doesn't seem to have that psychological like refreshment effect. But if you have your sort of 4 meals that you normally do, and then that 5th meal of the day is quite larger and it's a lot different, more satiating, that tends to sort of really like rejuvenate the client a little bit more than sort of adding 50 grams of rice to your other 4 meals or something like that. So I do use them not to increase metabolic rate or to increase lean mass retention or anything like that. It's purely just to increase the overall enjoyment of the protocol and potentially facilitate the adherence during the deficit days, because often if they're sort of day 4 and struggling during the week, they can sometimes, knowing that they've only got to go 2 more days before a refeed meal is coming and they can go out with their family and get some Nando's or get some sushi or something like that, that can just be a massive adherence facilitator in itself. So
Yeah.
yeah, I do still use them, but not for the physiological benefits that some might think I do.
Yeah. I really like what you said about just the trends of where things go and then come back to is so funny because I can think of things that I studied in training years ago when I first started interning as a strength coach, and just like the simplest programs, and things got so complex over time. And now I'm
Mhm.
right back to the basics of like
Yeah,
just hit my volume and progress it, you know, and it's
yeah,
pretty basic, and I'm getting better
yeah.
gains than ever. Cool. The last thing I wanted to kind of bring up and get your opinion on is just I don't know if ultra high carb is the right word, but it's become a little bit more popular to have a pretty high carb and low fat diet. I've seen pretty good experience with people just maintaining muscle and performance and getting through a diet just as good, unless it's just hard to adhere, because obviously if you lower fat, if you don't eat like the typical bro, that can be kind of hard, right? But for some people it's not an issue at all. Do you ever use those high carb lower fat approaches, especially I would say even like more advantageous in like a lean gaining phase where you can just keep cranking carbs up and keep fats kind of managed? Do you find any value in that? I know there's not a ton of research on it, but just from practical experience.
Yeah. So unless they're really, really against carbs or like just taking fats out of their diet is going to wreak havoc on their psychology, then I will try to push them with a low fat, high carb approach. Now, we don't have really well controlled studies on athletes comparing like a high carb, low fat versus higher fat and low carb, but we do have a reasonable theoretical rationale if we sort of pick apart single studies from here and there. So let's just say we're comparing like carbs and fats, calorie for calorie for calorie. Now, carbohydrates, they replenish glycogen, fats don't. When we have high glycogen stores, performance, both strength and endurance performance is enhanced, whereas fats don't achieve that either. We also know that in the context of a dieting phase, when muscle glycogen is really low for extended periods of time, there tends to be a suppression in muscle protein synthesis. So it makes sense in my mind that if we can sort of have a higher carbohydrate intake to potentially keep a higher glycogen content, or at least temporarily every now and again offset those low glycogen levels to suppress this catabolic signal that's happening, that could be advantageous as well. Now, carbs are anabolic from the perspective of the insulin mediated anabolic pathways and the way they activate those cellular mechanisms, whereas fats don't have that anabolic potential either. Now, if we're in just speaking in a fat loss context, most carbohydrate sources, unless you're eating honey, they're a lot more voluminous and less energy dense than fats are. Now, if you have too many high fats, your overall food volume and the energy the overall food volume is going to be lower and your energy density is going to be really higher. So basically what that means is you're consuming the same amount of calories, but with far less food going through the system. And that can have sort of nasty consequences on your satiety and your ability to manage hunger. Whereas if you're consuming low fats, so the sort of limiting those dense food sources and sort of substituting them with higher volume, higher fiber, and with fiber having its own hunger suppressing effects, and then you factor in sort of the whole grains and your ability to consume a higher volume of low energy dense foods like whole grains, fruits, vegetables. It's just extremely extremely more optimal for suppressing appetite, managing hunger when calories are quite restricted. And I just find, unless you're on keto, when you've got the ketones going through, which have the appetite suppressing effect, if you're just going like moderate high carb and sort of moderate fat, you're just a whole lot more hungrier because the food volume that's going through is less, the energy density is much higher, and the fiber going through is far less as well. So I just think that when we're weighing up carbs and fats, there's a lot more ticks on the carbohydrate side of the spectrum and just not many on the fats. If we weigh them up, the only real benefits that I can see of fats is that they can make your food taste a little bit nicer. That's the only real advantage. Now, how low is too low? We don't want to go sort of below our essential fatty acid needs, because we know that we need them for signaling chemical messengers and hormonal production and things like that. But the requirements to achieve that intake are just not very high. Somewhere around 0.5 gram per kilo of body weight it will suffice, or 20% of your calories. So it just seems to me like if you've got a client, unless they're just like, I need my peanut butter and my guacamole, it just seems like if you can keep that fat on the lower end, then you're going to obtain all those benefits from carbohydrates that just can't be matched by more fat intake.
I think that's a perfect answer, dude. I agree 100%. That's kind of how I look at it. And I think that, I think a lot of people forget too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, when you're dieting, a lot of those hormonal issues are not necessarily because your fat's low, it's because your calories are really low and you're in a diet. Right?
100%.
It's going to happen no matter what, even if you are on a high fat diet. If you're on keto and you're barely eating anything, which is probably not going to be a good keto diet, and you're probably going to have that issue regardless. So, man, you crushed this podcast. There was a ton of really applicable information that you gave. So I appreciate you coming on. I think the audience is going to get a lot out of this. So dude, thank you for your time. And last but not least, like, let us know where people can find you so we can list them in the show notes and let people learn from you more.
Awesome, man. I really enjoyed that chat. I think we went deep and hard, which was very cool. So best place to get me is on Instagram. Everything that I'm doing goes through there. That's just at Jackson Peos. And I've recently started my YouTube channel, mostly focused on educational content and a little bit of lifestyle content. So if you could drop me a subscribe on my YouTube, that would be hugely appreciated.
Perfect, dude. I'll link both those in the show notes. And once again, dude, thank you.
Thank you, man. It was a great chat.